Hi everyone, it's Raina. So this video is if you have your natal Uranus in the sign of Sagittarius. This transit occurred from November 1981 through November 1988. And you would have to check if you're born in the month of November in either 81 or 88, you're going to have to check to see the exact dates for that. But anyway, it looks like to me that this is going to comprise about half of the millennials, or Generation Y, I guess they call them, and then the last year of Generation X, perhaps. I think Generation Y began in 82, so something along those lines. Uranus is this disruptive influence, innovative influence. It's the ruler of Aquarius. So it's associated with progressive change, but it can come all of a sudden. It can be erratic, it can be eccentric, and it can be a breath of fresh air, but it can be kind of disturbing because it is unpredictable. And Sagittarius is a sign that is connected with expansion because its ruler is Jupiter. So whether that's of the mind, higher education, whether that's of the spiritual sense of the word, it's the God house, the ninth house that Sag rules, or philosophy, which is being intentional about the way you view your life and the way you live your life, and geographically expansive, long distance travel, or the adventurous kind of a spirit. Both the planet Uranus and the sign of Sagittarius are about freedom. You could say freedom at any cost. So when Uranus is in Sagittarius, it's almost like a wildfire in a sense, because it's both of these influences are yearning to break free, to be themselves. You know, Uranus wants to be an individual. Sag certainly wants to express itself creatively, autonomously. So this generation has that spirit for sure, but we would look at certain things that were going on at the time that souls were incarnating from 1981 to 1988. What was going on during that time? Well, as somebody who was in high school during the first half of that, or some of that, and then, going into my 20s, early 20s, this was the era in the United States of the Reagan administration. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is because we can look to what was going on in the collective and how that affected attitudes, how that kind of pushed back on other people's ideas. Because when Ronald Reagan took office, something called the moral majority followed him there. And these were televangelists who were banding together to create this Christian conservative movement. And, for instance, I was raised a Christian myself, but I was raised more of a liberal Christian. So, I wasn't, threatened with eternal hell and things like that. That's not what we talked about. It was more of a, serving in the model of Jesus, helping other people, that kind of thing. And so fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, really came alive during the 80s. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because Uranus and Sagittarius also coincides with a period in the United States. I can only speak about the United States because that's where I live and that's where I've always lived. And that's all I know. I can't speak about, what other people were doing in other countries at that time. But that was the time when I was in my late teens when the New Age really came into being. And even today, we use the term New Age, although I don't know, some people use it derisively. It doesn't have the same respect as a term or a label that it did in the past, I think. But it was a distinct difference from organized religion. It was more open-ended, and it was mystical. You could call it metaphysics. And that was when I first became exposed to these ideas. Now, I just happened to be a certain age. I was in my late teens when I began this exploration. And I was just recently looking at information by Dolores Cannon, who some of you may be familiar with, and I'm just learning about in recent years. And she was talking about when she started doing her transcriptions as a hypnotist that had to do with past lives. I believe she started in the 80s, and she was saying how nobody else was doing this, that there were only a few types of books like that. And I can definitely attest to that because I remember being this voracious reader. There were more than just a couple, but in that particular vein where they really explored the past lives. And now there's like many, many, many times as many books as there were back then. It's just like old hat now, but back then it wasn't that common. And in 1987, there was something called the harmonic convergence. It was in the summer of 1987, August to be exact, where they had I guess they had like a global meditation, but there was also like an astrological alignment. I guess it was connected to the Mayan calendar. Of course, we've heard of that before with the year 2012. So that was something that was publicized, and like I said, that was 1987. So that was closer to the tail end of this. But it's a perfect example of the Aquarian ideal, which is about the collective. And that's what Uranus, the Uranian influence, is all about. The 11th house that Uranus rules in the sign of Aquarius is about the collective rather than the individual. So in Sagittarius, it joins people together in the name of God. And this was just one of those types of events that did it. Now, when I actually went on Wikipedia to refresh my memory about the harmonic convergence, because I remember, I don't know about celebrating it, but I remember being with someone that night and, being aware that it was happening. But when I went to Wikipedia to find that out, I saw the name Shirley MacLaine, and she was very big during the 80s because she was an actress, but she had these far out metaphysical beliefs. Again, not organized religion, not fundamentalist religion, but the occult, esoterica, the whole 9 yards. And she was she was like widely ridiculed for her beliefs. She had a very famous book called Out on a Limb. And it came out, I think, in 1982. So I'm recording this at the end of 2022. So that would be 40 years ago. And I remember, working in a library at that time as a teenager, and that book just going in and out, in and out. People just checking it out, bringing it back, checking it out, bringing it back. And they even made a movie on one of her books. I think it was Out on a Limb, but she had books after that. Dancing in the Light, I remember that one. And the thing was, she was a mainstream actress talking about these far out things. As a matter of fact, the first time I heard about a Pleiadian was in Out on a Limb. And so she was talking about galactic beings or star beings back 40 years ago. So during this time, these kinds of things were finding their way to the mainstream culture. Again, nowadays, there are still people that ridicule it. It is still not something that is accepted like as widely as we would expect after 40 years, but it is more mainstream. And so this was a generation that came up with this. Another thing connected to Uranus is technology. And I mentioned televangelists. Televangelists use television to spread their ministry. And I was going to look this up, but I would just go out on a limb, pardon the pun, and say that probably it really took off during the 80s, because that's when I remember televangelists. There were some big televangelist scandals that happened at the tail end of this time period. Jimmy Swaggart, Jim Bakker, both famous TV preachers who had sex scandals. So, and by the way, Sagittarius, one of the shadow aspects of Sagittarius is being a hypocrite, preaching something but not living it. But other technology, like for instance, home computers, that was something that I first saw toward, the latter, maybe around 1987. I belonged to a writers group and I was in my early 20s, and there were already people starting to print things out with kind of rudimentary computers, word processors. Word processors were a step up from typewriters, but they were still based on that computer model where you could go back and you could edit, and you I feel like I'm talking about a Victrola or something. And I don't even know if how many younger people know what a Victrola is. But talking about typewriters where you couldn't erase something unless you actually painted over it or taped over it. And I'm thinking, how did we ever type up research papers or things like that without having the ability to just totally erase it? It's crazy. But somehow it happened. So, Uranus is connected to technology and spreading, publishing. So publishing, it can be Sag, ninth house. And so the connection of that was a big step forward when the word processor became very popular in the latter half of the 80s. Even before PCs, although they did come, they were also available in, the very early forms. I was going to even talk about video games, but I'm looking at the Sag connection, not just, technology. And let me see, I think there was something else that I wanted to mention. I think I did one of these with Uranus that related to Libra. And I believe that one was maybe in the early 70s or something along those lines. And I was talking about these relationships that had freedom connected to them, or free love, or something like that. I can't remember exactly what I said. But I would say that the 80s were a time when divorce was something that was pretty much old hat. It wasn't scandalous, it wasn't uncommon. And, as soon as somebody wanted to be free, that was that. So I feel that this half generation, if you will, came of age at a time when people were even less inclined to just stay together because of the kids or whatever. Their freedom was their number one priority. And it's always more interesting to talk about, 15-year cycles, like a generational cycle, because you're looking at things over a larger amount of time. And it almost feels that 7 years isn't enough. But I think that when you look, that's why I do look at the political influences, because I think it does tend to affect the collective. And when I was talking about the moral majority in the United States, that did cause a pushback, because Ronald Reagan also enacted a drug war. They had this thing, just say no to drugs. And they became very aggressive about drugs. And the thing that, because I'm going to be doing the numerology of decades too, and I was thinking about the number 7 in the 1970s, and how, 7 is connected to Neptune. And I feel like, the 70s was a time when drug use became mainstream. People think of the 60s and drugs, and really, um, I think that the 70s were when the average person first started doing that, because everything filtered down. It took time for it to reach suburbia. And so in the 80s, there was this, there was a lot of alienation. And when I get to the number 8, talk about what that reps, and coldness, compared to there's more of a intimate, dreamy feeling of the 70s, and unreal, like a kind of a fantasy. And the 80s was this cold, hard reality, the Cold War. So when I talk about all of that, and think about the drugs, they were really coming down hard, and yet they were someone, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, was bringing cocaine into the inner city, setting up uh, the future crack epidemic, and um, creating addiction in very vulnerable communities, and also an underground economy. And so that is a form of hypocrisy. Doing, saying, just say no to drugs, and then yet the same people, presumably, seeding poor communities with um, drugs, and encouraging a black market economy, underground economy, that created more gangs, violence, agony. So very hypocritical, wouldn't you say? So the idea of what is the idea of true freedom is the question. Because when you push back against that and you say, I want to be able to do what I want to do, it doesn't, sometimes people are rebels without a cause. So it's that's why sometimes these draconian measures, I think, are enacted. So they force the individual to react instead of to act. Because when you act, you're coming from your sovereignty. When you're reacting, you're still at somebody else's mercy. So, anyway, I could go on and on about this, but I just wanted to give a few thoughts about Uranus and Sagittarius. Thanks for listening. Take care. Bye.